orphanage after my mom had a nervous breakdown on the birth of her sixth child. I'm the oldest of seven, and that the experience is indelibly impressed on my awareness. I mean, I understand how difficult it is for people who are trying to make ends meet. I also understand people who are reaching up and trying to aspire to do better in life. And because I've seen the journey, I've experienced the journey. But I also know a lot of people I grew up with, including siblings, didn't have the same breaks that I had in life. And I decided a long time ago, before I got into public life, that if I ever got anywhere in life, I would make it a point to not just remember where I came from, but to try to do something about the conditions that I experienced growing up, which are being experienced today by so many people.
You mentioned your mother had a nervous breakdown, as you said, after her postpartum nervous breakdown, postpartum depression.
Right.
How was she treated? Like, was there a support system for that? Was there medical care that was she covered? She was able to get medical care. And my dad, as a Teamster, had access to a fairly decent health plan at that point. But there was nowhere for the children to go other than to leave the newborn with some relatives. And the rest of us went to what was then known as Parmadale in Cleveland. It's a Catholic orphanage. And it was, although it was a period, we were there for probably about 3 months over the holidays, it was tough. And it was tough thinking that you're not going to see your parents again. And for my mom, it took her quite a while to recover. It probably took her a year to recover. And we moved out to a farm for a while in Michigan from Ohio. And during that time, she was able to get her smile back and get her sense of vitality back. But let's face it, for any woman who's ever given birth to 10, as she did, with 3 not quite making it to birth, and raising 7 children, it was a tremendous strain on her. And she was well educated. She taught me to read by the time I was 3 years old. Oh wow!
And that was probably the single most important factor in my growing up, that I could read so early. And my mom did that.
And how old were you when this happened? When you lived, you went to live in the...
I think it was 12 or 13.
12 or 13, you said? Okay. So that's like a very formative age, right?
We were living in Parmadale when I was about 11 years old.
11, yeah.
But when we were... and we were living in a car before that, the tremendous stress that a family had then, and today in some families experience it, where you aren't sure where you're going to live. I mean, even though my dad worked pretty steadily, the size of the family was such, and the expenses of a large family was such, that he was never able to make ends meet. And not only that, but you also had the insults which happen in the inner city, where people are buying television sets that don't work, cars that break down. There's all the scam artists that are out there beating people up. We experienced that, and that, of course, gave me a great sympathy for consumer matters. And led, whether people Cleveland know it or not, actually led to my efforts to form help form Cleveland's Department of Consumer Affairs back in 1972.
Wow. Because you saw people getting ripped off?
Absolutely. I mean, wherever you turn. The life in the inner city, it's not just what David Kaplowitz wrote about, saying poor pay more. And it's a current problem as well. But it's also, people selling life insurance policies on the children. And, it's everywhere you turn, there's some kind of a scam going on. And, of course, it made me rather street smart, and I took those street smarts into government.
Well, okay, so let's get to that. So you're 19, 20 years old. You decide to run for the city council.
Right.
Where did that idea come from? And then you don't have any money. Did you actually have an expectation that you were going to get elected? And what was the plan? And how did you manage to do it? You did it actually by the time you were 22, 23, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, look, I was working at the night desk at the Plain Dealer answering phones, and some guy called in from a bar, said they had a candidate who was going to run for council, and I had no idea about city council. I actually was interested in my mid-teens to being a congressperson. I even wrote it in an autobiography that I wrote, I think, in the 10th grade. I wanted to be in national politics. But when I heard about this rattling going on from a bar, I just turned to an assistant city editor and I said, what do you have to do to be a councilman? He says, well, you have to file petitions. And then the next thing he smiled and he said, why, are you interested? And I thought, hey, yeah, I am. It was in the neighborhood I lived in. And so that one thing led to another. I took out petitions. I started knocking on doors. One disadvantage I had is while I may have been 20, I looked like I was 12. And the first door I knocked on, a woman looked at me, walked away for a second. I waited nonplussed, and she came forward, opened the screen door, and passed some coins in my hands and said, I thought I already paid you for the paper.
Oh, my God, it's really funny.
And, it was just a problem with credibility. People had no idea that of my age. And when I ran a closest race that anybody had run to this incumbent, then people started to pay attention.
And so that you go on, you make the city council in your early 20s. I think you're mayor by the time you're 30 or 31.
31, yeah.
Yeah. So were you where does that fit in the history of youngest elected politicians in the country? Was either of those things?
Well, the headline in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the subhead said youngest big city mayor wins by 3,000 votes, and that was in the Plain Dealer on Wednesday. I think it was November 9th, 1977. So yeah, I started very early. 10 years after I started in politics, I was elected mayor.
Wow!
And immediately you had very high-profile clashes with some of the industrial and financial powers in the city. You clashed with the light utility over the baseball stadium, if I'm not mistaken, right? And then there was another. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me, if I may. I was elected mayor of Cleveland on a promise to save the city's municipal electric system from a takeover by a utility monopoly. For all intents and purposes, the system was sold. I blocked it with a petition drive, which led to me becoming a candidate for mayor. And this was a defining issue in the mayor's race in 1977. And I was elected on the promise to save the electric system, which provided the people of Cleveland with cheaper electricity and savings on street lights and providing electricity to dozens of city facilities. But what happened, while my first act in office was to declare that the sale of Muni Light was dead and that Muni Light was, in fact, assured of being in public control. At that very moment, the utility that I was contesting with and their bank partners laid a trap, which led to December 15th, 1978, me being told either I sell that electric system to its competitor, private utility monopoly, or the banks would not renew the city's credit on loans I hadn't even taken out on $14.5 million in loans. So that was a pivotal moment in my life, not just my career, where I had to decide what I stood for. Did I stand for the people's right to own a utility they could call their own? Did I stand for their right to be able to save money on an electric bill? What did I stand for? Did I stand for the autonomy of city government to be able to make decisions without the pressure from interest groups? And so I refused to sell. And the biggest bank in Ohio, which was also a major shareholder in the utility, the private utility, refused to renew the city's credit. unprecedented. Cleveland went into default, first city to go into any fiscal default since the Great Depression. And, the pressure on me was enormous. The media was part of it. They were all aligned with the utility. The social reality and political reality of Cleveland had been reconstructed to assume I had no other alternative but to sell. But I said no. And that cost me the mayor's office. But, 15 years later, I made a comeback.
I think you also told me a story once about using eminent domain to block the sale of a hospital or the closing of a hospital.
Well, I had eminent domain is something that cities usually only use to help developers. And I was ready to use eminent domain to expand the city's electric system, to save public, to protect the public interest at any turn. The one thing, that I haven't said anything about that probably bears repeating right now is that 40 years ago, I started a book about this experience as mayor of Cleveland, taking on the banks and the utilities and the mob for that matter, because there were 3 assassination attempts. And I just finished the book recently. It's called, the working title is called The Division of Light and Power. It's about 618 pages of text with over 3,000 footnotes in addition to that. And it's really the story of one young person's clash with the powers that be in a community and the insistence that there is such a thing as a public interest, which every public official has an obligation to uphold. And it's a wild story. I just finished it, and I'm out there right now. I'll be looking for a publisher soon.
And can you talk about the assassination attempts?
Yeah, there was one attempt in January of '77 when I was starting up this fight to protect the electric system. A high-powered rifle shot through my house, where I'm calling from right now, and I had just got up out of my chair. The bullet missed. The bullet missed my head by a fraction of an inch and went through. Went clear through the house, and then there was another one on Easter Sunday '78 where police chased a guy away with a shotgun, and he basically in a tussle with police escaped. And then another one, which was a subject of a U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime investigation, where I was supposed to be the grand marshal in a parade in the black community. And the mafia, there was a mafia hit planned, and I would have been in that parade, except that when I was getting ready to go to the parade, I had a bleeding ulcer that came out of nowhere, and I was rushed to the hospital and transfused eventually with about 6 units of blood, and I almost died from that, but it saved my life because I wasn't in the parade. So, I've had my share of ups and downs and of conflicts in public life. But the one thing that I have always felt is that it's critical. Just stay true to who you are and true to who you represent, and don't feel that you have to give in. No matter which powers are arrayed against you, you have to stand for something, and that's basically the approach I take in life.
So that experience of running for office at a very young age, succeeding without a whole lot of institutional backing, you take on a lot of financial and industrial powers in office. You kind of repeat that whole plot later on at the federal level when you decide in the early 2000s to run for president. Can you talk a little bit about what your thinking was in 2004 prior to that election? Because it was a bit of a similar situation, right?
I'll tell you what happened. You have to go back to the Clinton administration's attack on Serbia. They decided to bomb Serbia at a time that the people there were really interested in the overthrow of Milosevic. And I saw in the Democratic caucus normally calm, placid people rally to a bombing, and that led me to become involved sub rosa in an event, in a effort that surfaced that blocked Clinton's congressional approval for the war. But that got me thinking about war and about how wars start and how governments approve of them and how people get swept up in it. And so when after 9/11, I saw the country swept up in this war fury again. And I started to dissect what was going on, whether the call for war was legitimate or not. And I actually have posted on the internet, if somebody typed in October 2nd, 2002, Kucinich analysis of Iraq war resolution, where I knew then that there was no legitimate reason to go to war against Iraq, and I laid it out. And then I saw what was happening, notwithstanding that, how we went to war and innocent people were dying, American troops were dying, a country was being wrecked, our aspirations at home were being destroyed. And so when I saw that, I said, unless someone else comes forward, I'm going to run. As improbable as my candidacy was, and may still seem in retrospect to some, I determined that if no one else was going to make the war an issue, I would. And so that led me on an extraordinary journey across the country, meeting people and seeing how the American people, by and large, have a lot in common. And what they have in common is they want decent lives for their families. They want to make sure that they're safe. They're not interested in sending troops around the world to kill other people. That campaign proved to me that there's an underlying unity in America, but our politics are so divisive and so pecuniary in nature that it's very tough to connect with the American people on their level of aspirations.
That connection you talk about, that unity on that issue and some others, including working class politics. I've noticed in sort of recent media treatments of your career that oftentimes, for instance, the Washington Post talked about how your politics represent the sweet spot between where Sandersism meets Trumpism. They talked about your nearly Trumpian parables of good and evil. Is there an issue now where any politician who tries to build a bridge between left and right gets that comparison? In other words, you're appealing to Trump people. There's an issue there. There's a problem there.
You have to look at the mindset in the world today, which of course affects our politics. We have a tremendous amount of polarization and compartmentalized thinking. And people have trouble holding complexities. They have trouble with seemingly mutually contradictory premises existing simultaneously. And so the idea that one can unify left and right seems quite impossible to some. But I would argue that even what we try to describe as left and right is fundamentally flawed. That and not just not just with respect to the definitions, but that to me there's nothing left or right about healthcare, about education, about jobs, and the attempt to try to turn it into polarities is to me an effort to avoid debate and not to encourage it. There's not always two sides to every question. There's not two sides to whether you assassinate a foreign leader or not. There are certain principles that need to guide a country that there are that are beyond notional and go to verities of what life is about, what's a country about, what the practical aspirations of people are concerned about. And so, left, right, to me, doesn't do it. Labels don't do it. They don't describe people's challenges and their daily their ability to be able to make it day to day. So I reject the foundational aspects of present day partisan politics, and say that it doesn't serve anybody except a narrow elite, and often disserves the people of this country by not truly offering any kind of a choice or even a solid a position from which one can come to a fair conclusion about whether one approves or disapproves of what someone's offering. It's all smoke and mirrors and deception, and I'm not interested in that. To me, if I ran into a guy in Cleveland who was standing on a corner and his arm, he rolled up his sleeve and his arm was filled with watches, I knew those watches were phony. And I know the political party is selling phony solutions and offering phony proposals to the people of this country.
So just getting back to 2004, you run for president on a platform that people thought at the time was crazy. They laughed at it, but it's become mainstream. You were opposed to NAFTA. You were for gay marriage. You were for marijuana legalization. You were against the Iraq War. Universal health care. All these things nobody laughs at those issues anymore. What role do you think the media had in convincing people to not take these things seriously? I remember covering that campaign. It was very frustrating. I wondered what your experience was with that and how hard it was for you to try to get that message out.
Well, one need not be naive about the role of the media in our society. When it comes to war, media is essentially steer carriers, and today, media war is clickbait, and we have to understand that the conglomeration in the media has affected the politics of the country, and there's no, media generally is going to have sensibilities that align with the corporate interests of the owners. Like A.J. Liebling said years ago, freedom of the press belongs to the person who owns one. So I think we have to we have to be realistic. The media beat the drums for the war in 2002, 2003. The media permitted George Bush to be able to conflate Iraq and 9/11. The media gave great amounts of coverage to those who were for the war, and very little coverage to those who were opposed to it. And what's interesting, even to this day, those who opposed the war, and those of us who were very vocal about it, are seldom asked for our opinion about any other foreign policy. Well, those who were, repeatedly wrong, not just about Iraq, but about Libya and a number of other conflicts, and wrong about Iran, they're continually asked for their opinion, and their opinions are arrogated to some type of ceremony of a religion or something. We really have a problem, and the airwaves are saturated with the opinions of those who are interested in war, and in some cases have a financial stake in a war.
I remember back then one of the things that you were well known for was you had proposed a Department of Peace, and I remember the reaction of the press to that idea. Has anyone ever given you a good reason why that isn't a good idea? I mean, that was
right.
It would cost too much. In 1972, I proposed free transit in Cleveland, and the opposition to it said, "Well, if you have that, everybody's going to want to ride the bus."
Oh, how terrible! That's awful.
When I proposed the Department of Peace, the idea of it is, because it's an active consideration, is that we can teach peace. If violence is a learned response from all the stimuli that any of us get in our environment, then you can also learn peace. And so the idea is you start teaching peace giving, peace sharing, mutuality, looking at the other person as an aspect of oneself, and you start doing that at a very early age. And so you build peace into the culture of the country, and as opposed to war, which is so deeply ingrained, and the violence that comes with it. So the Department of Peace, the idea was that you'd have a domestic component, and which would deal with domestic violence, spousal abuse, child abuse, violence in the school, gang violence, gun violence, racial violence, violence against gays, police community relations, clashes, police community clashes. And then on an international level, you use diplomacy as you start to see problems percolating. So you do everything you can to avert conflict, and you train people to how to do that. I pegged the budget as being 1% of the current, whatever the current Pentagon budget would be. Then it was about it would have been $4 billion a year. But we need to create a structure in our society to give people some other options that they don't feel like the only way that they can deal with their problems is through lashing out, is through killing other people. And the thing that I think it's critical to bring home is this. All this violence that the United States wreaks around the world, all these wars and undeclared wars and the various ways of our government and working through hundreds of bases in 70 different countries. Is there anyone out there that doesn't understand that violence that we sow abroad comes back home? The world is interconnected. It's interdependent. There is no way to avoid when you kill people abroad that it doesn't come back. That you do not. What you do is you create a consciousness of violence, and that consciousness achieves a certain velocity with the media and with movies and everything else. And before you know it, life doesn't seem to have as much value. And it's a problem which exists today.
This week was Martin Luther King Day, and I mean, he's someone who really talked about that, the intersection of different types of violence, and, the violence here in the United States, and then the violence of the war in Vietnam. But so many of the people who claim to tout his ideas or respect him are the same people who would mock something like what you're talking about.
Look, I'm talking from Cleveland right now. There's a tremendous amount of violence that's happening on the streets of the city. How does it get that way? How does a society get that way? We're not looking at those things. We're really. It's almost as if people believe you can't do anything about it, and so I believe you can do something about it. I believe that we're not here to live in a world where people believe that life is a funeral march to the grave. Life is to be celebrated. Life is to be treasured and cherished, and we need to do everything we can to protect the instinct towards. It's what the poet called the instinct within us that reaches and towers. And we have to protect our ability to reach up to build a better world than maybe is a world even beyond our imagination. And violence cuts that short.
In that vein, again, a lot of the ideas that you ran on in 2004 and 2008, looking back, people say, "Oh, that's obvious." Well, universal health care, what a great idea. Legalization of marijuana. I feel like one of the things that people are eventually going to realize is obvious is your attitude towards the mixture of politics and funding from weapons contractors. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't feel that you can really pursue any kind of progressive agenda if you're being funded by people who make money off war, and that seems obvious now, but it's not yet in the mainstream.
We have to be aware of the extent to which war is built into our system. every congressional district has defense contractors who lobby members of Congress when the budget authorizations and appropriations are up. And so there's a constituency to keep the spending going and to keep the use of those war material ever present. And it's so distorted our priorities. Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Vilmas wrote the book about the $3 trillion war, which is probably more looking like 5, if not 6, the result of Afghanistan and Iraq. People make money off of war. I mean, it's as General Smedley Butler once said, it's a racket. And when you understand that it's a racket, you understand how people's lives are put on the line for it. It's horrific. And you don't need to be the aging pop star Boy George to say war is stupid. It has no real purpose in a world which is technologically advanced, is interconnected and interdependent, where I can speak to you across 600 miles on a cell phone, or I can call the other side of the world, send a text message in a matter of seconds to anybody anywhere in the world. What are we talking about here? Why are we still in, looking for war when we ought to be looking for peace? Why are we looking for opportunities to stir things up as a nation? Why do we even have people in our government who can influence a president to assassinate a leader, as they did at the beginning of the year when Iranian General Soleimani was murdered? We have to demand peace. We cannot accept anymore our government spending the treasure of our nation, distorting our national priorities. We're losing the chance for the lives that all of us want in these wars. And I'm sick of people using the flag. I'm sick of people using a distorted version of patriotism. I say it's patriotic to have education for all, free college for all, health care for all, decent wages for every American. That's patriotic. It's patriotic to have clean environment. It's patriotic to have safe streets. We need to rework that idea of patriotism and tear it away from the idea that you can only be patriotic when you stand and beat the drums for war. We absolutely have to change America's role in the world. I say close the bases abroad, bring America home. We don't need to be spending the billions of dollars that we do having a position of oversight of the world through our military. America needs a fundamental and structural change in its governance and in its economy for this country to be able to prosper.
It's funny how people will call you naive or call people with the view that you're expressing naive, but they don't believe or acknowledge how much having lobbyists influences the decisions to go to war. They're actually incredibly naive. People who think that we go to war for reasons that are moral or politically pure. And I had two other questions. One is if you think that the attempt to kind of equate left and right is cynical. People will say that Trump and Bernie are similar in a way that I actually think that they're just making the case that Bernie is electable against Trump because they're saying that he appeals to some of the same people Trump does. And I haven't really seen that before. I think it's a really weird argument.
They also say the same thing about Tulsi a little bit. Yeah,
sure. Tulsi and Trump. Yeah. The idea that because you as a politician can speak to a certain population that we would like to win, that makes you somehow Trumpian as opposed to competitive against them.
It's an important question because it really is what frames our politics today. you can simultaneously argue, well, there are people who align on the left and there are people who align on the political right. We got that. The concern is, do they have any underlying mutuality of interest? And I say yes, there are. But you have to take time to develop them. And why is there such an emphasis on left and right? It's marketing. There's people to whom political resources are allocated based on their insistence that they stand with the left or they stand with the right. There's fundraising that goes on along those lines. But the real world exists not as a pure liberal or pure conservative. There's elements of each that thread their way through all of our lives. And it's the polarization that's the problem. It's the belief that unless you buy the kit and caboodle of a political ideology, you somehow aren't a righteous person. And this is all crazy. The country's being sharply divided over ideas that really aren't very well thought out. I mean, if you would get underneath this all, maybe it's the fact that outside of predatory capitalism, America really doesn't have a cogent political philosophy.
It seems like it's also a way to delegitimize things like anti-war sentiment or the embrace of universal programs. If you pretend that those things are Trumpian and Sandersian or Trumpian and Gabardian, then they're extremist things, even though we know that they actually have mass support. So it's a way to undermine actual universal programs or peace. I mean, not to be too dramatic about it.
That's true.
And on that note of universal programs, I just want to ask, we've heard some candidates like Klobuchar and Mayor Pete make the argument that universal programs are unfair because the wealthy will take advantage of them and we shouldn't ask poor people to be paying for those. And as someone who, experienced the hardships that you did as a young person, especially, what is your response to that?
Well, look, let's get real here. I don't think there should be means testing for any federal program. There shouldn't be means testing for Social Security. We should take the caps off for sure as to how much income is available to be taxed. But there shouldn't be means testing for education. Everyone should be able to share in the bounty of the country.
Right.
And the fact that others want to means test is just a way of dividing people and having people who have great influence say, well, if I'm not going to get anything, no one should.
Right. And so it's so disingenuous because it's such a way they're pretending that they're doing it to protect poor people and working class people from having to pay for the, people like Barron Trump who's going to go to a public.
Yeah, it's going to be inherently unfair.
Yeah, inherently unfair. Yeah. But I mean, one of the reasons that universal programs are so important and means tested programs can be so dangerous is because of the stigma that goes along with them. And did you experience that when you were growing up? Like, was there a sense that you were getting special treatment or you were dependent on handouts and in a way that you wouldn't have felt had more programs been?
It wasn't, let me tell you, if it wasn't for the nuns at the various schools I went to, there are times our family wouldn't have even had decent clothes on our back. I mean, I remember one year I wore one pair of pants for most of the year. They were turquoise blue with black piping. It looked probably like something out of a psychedelic prison. And it was the only pair of pants I had until one day a neighborhood dog went after me and ripped them. And then I had to wear ripped pants to school until a teacher saw it and said, hey, what's going on? And that led to her giving clothes to our family. The idea of a handout, it's about a hand up. It's not about a handout. I mean, everybody should have a chance in our society to make it. And for those who are less fortunate with a little bit of help, they can become more fortunate. It's not, we can't, here again, we divide people. We divide people and say, well, haves and have-nots. No, we're all, if we are truly one nation, then we should be looking at ourselves as one, not just haves and have-nots. We need to have a more fair distribution of opportunities, and the tax system is one way that can help make that happen. Ending war can help make that happen. Changing our monetary policy so that you don't have money being created out of nothing and given to the banks and who are foreclosing homes of people who they sold low-doc loans. We have a country that is increasingly divided on class lines, sometimes on race, on economic lines. And while you can't, there's always going to be some of that. We can never let it be institutionalized. And these programs like healthcare for all and Social Security and education for all are ways of protecting what is essentially American. That is, that we have some underlying unity of cause and purpose in our nation.
Congressman, I know we'll let you go in a moment. Just really quickly, we're about to head into Iowa and New Hampshire. This has been an unprecedented, crazy campaign season. What's your diagnosis of what's going on with the Democratic Party? They had 29 candidates run this year. It almost seems like the party bureaucracy is trying to prevent at all costs moving in the direction that you suggested so many years ago. What do you think? How do you think this is going to shake out, and what do you think they're thinking in terms of their strategy going forward?
Well, look, you have two parties, but they're actually one party of a corporate behemoth in America. And what we need to do is to really consider whether or not the two-party system serves this country, whether or not it's time to decouple presidency from the two-party system which rules Congress. This is there's a fundamental flaw in a system which lets corporations dictate the choices that people have at the end. And with Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United, that's kind of where we're at. One thing about the Sanders campaign is he's been raising a lot of money independent of those interests. That's, I think, why the party will continue to try to frustrate his efforts. The same with Tulsi Gabbard on another level. Look, let me just add this. To me, it's never made sense that there's only two ways of looking at the world, and a Democrat way and a Republican way. It's just it's past confounding. It's a demonstrable lie that does violence to the idea of an America which out of many we are one. We're ignoring the diversity of opinions in this country, and in some ways that's what political parties seem to be set up to do.
We've had terrible wildfires in Australia this year. I know this is an issue that's near and dear to your heart, climate change. You proposed ages ago a Works Green administration. What needs to be done, and is this the biggest issue for you this year going forward?
Well, it's interrelated with war, because war is ecocide. War destroys. You want to talk about things that will raise atmospheric carbon levels. War is nothing but an exchange of destructive levels of carbon propelled by carbon, and propelled, I might add, by fossilized thinking. So you have to ask yourself, what can we do to start to bring down levels of atmospheric carbon so we can ameliorate some of the changes that are happening? We're not going to reverse them, but we can slow them down. I think one of the things is taking a regenerative approach towards agriculture, looking at carbon sequestration, how to accelerate it using certain growing methods, changing fuels that are used. Perhaps green jet fuel will be a direction that some of the airlines will go in. That some of them are looking at it right now, and some are even experimenting with it. Using alcohol instead of oil for fuel, the waste to alcohol, using waste to create fuel, and that would supplant oil. And what's happening is there is a growing awareness on the part of corporations that they need to take a different direction. Oil companies know this. They only spent perhaps 1% of their revenue in looking towards the greening of their industry last year, but they understand that it's not sustainable, the track that they're on. Investment companies are aware of it. Some big investment banks in Europe, as well as even a firm such as BlackRock, is now looking at investments in protecting and restoring the climate. So I think we're seeing a shift come about, but it's not happening fast enough. And the undercurrent of our politics, which is so wrapped up in war for oil, is keeping us locked into this, for the next few years, certainly, and into policies which keep using fossil fuel, which use oil and gas, and and fracking, which is so destructive of the environment and public health. So we can go in a new direction. We can have a works green administration, but you have to have an awareness in Washington of the urgency of taking that direction. And there are people who are aware, but certainly not enough. And this is where the country ought to be uniting now. This is where the country's efforts ought to be, not in trying to rattle the swords against Iran, but how can we unite the world community? Years ago, I was with Mikhail Gorbachev at a summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, where we talked about a global green project. And, we need to unite the world community instead of playing the game of nations, a geopolitical game that would put us on the precipice of war continually to control resources, mainly oil, that if we keep having fights over that, we'll stay addicted to carbon and addicted to war.
Last thing, Congressman, on the trail I saw you, I'd never saw anybody whose books were more marked up in the margins and who seemed to read as voraciously as you do, even during a political campaign. A lot of our listeners are very in despair right now about media choices, how they stay informed. Do you have any advice for people about what they can do to keep informed in an era when traditional media doesn't seem to address a lot of what people are concerned about?
I look at media the way I walked into a cafeteria, although I have to confess I'm vegan, so my choices are a little bit different. But as I do that, I read everything I can get my hands on and watch anything that might relate to it. And it's my tastes are very eclectic, and so I find that I'm not interested in carrying anyone's intellectual water, but I'll read across the political spectrum, and I'll look at sometimes abstracts of university studies, or I'll also look at speeches and read my the website of the local papers and then the national and international, talk to people around the world constantly, and you get a sense of what's going on. It's not about being right or wrong. It's being informed to the best of your ability so you can be a good citizen. That's I think all of us owe that to each other and to our country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
great.
Dennis. I really appreciate it.
Let me just say that I'm really grateful for the chance to do this.
Thanks so much, Dennis. Appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Talk to you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
I learned something today.
What'd you learn? But I love our idea. We have the idea to say what we've learned, but so far we're really good at I learned something today, but then we don't recap it.
We don't really recap.
We got to have what are our takeaways?
I think you learned that Dennis Kucinich is a very erudite
guy.
Right?
Yeah,
That surprised
I couldn't believe
right?
he's way nerdier than I thought. He's very learned. And hey, I would like to learn if you had ever witnessed this on the campaign
trail.
I have.
Interesting that you should ask that,
Yeah.
Katie. Yeah, no, so when I first covered Kucinich in 2004, I remember seeing him, I think it was at the University of New Hampshire, the first time I saw him, and he'd given a speech, and after the speech, he runs off and he reaches into a bag, which is like full of books, like chock full of books, and he pulls out a book and he goes and just sits down in a corner and starts reading to himself. And I see that his books are all marked up, which I would later see that he does all the time. Every book is written up in the margins. But this is the presidential candidate is off reading, so I go and ask him, like, "Is this for a speech? Like, are you picking out a passage or something?" No, he's just reading. It was just like somebody in between events was just educating himself, which is totally unusual for a presidential candidate. They're always talking to each other, so
he's not calculating on that front, at least.
Not at all. He didn't care what people thought of him, and he's just a super interesting guy. He's very intellectually courageous, I would say. Like the thing that I always thought was distinguished him as a politician was that he looked at running for president the way of an intellectually serious person would. Like, what if you were actually trying to solve all these problems with the actual best solutions? What would you come up with? As opposed to what would actually work.
Yes,
as opposed to what would pass.
Right. He's not because there's she has a plan for that. That's the whole technocracy slogan.
Right.
He's not like that at all. He's very well read and very erudite, but he also has a very strong moral framework, which he owns. He is very well read, and he talks about how he reads abstracts of academic papers and stuff. And you heard him.
No, he reads philosophers he doesn't agree with. I always thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's very important.
But his idea about the Department of Peace, not to go on about this, but he looks at all these different issues, mass shootings, domestic violence, crime on the streets, all these things. And the way he looks at it is it's all one problem, right? So if we could go in and we could teach people as an affirmative the value, how to nonviolent conflict resolution, we could probably take care of a lot of these problems much more cheaply, easily, and we wouldn't go to war as much. All these things. Let's devote 1/100th of the Pentagon budget to fixing that, and let's see what happens. And they just the degree to which he was laughed at for even bringing these things up was just crazy. But hopefully, eventually, the people will come around on some of this stuff, and they have.
My dad is like that. He takes a lot. Like if we go away for the weekend, he'll have a suitcase full of books and a rolly thing. So it gets really annoying. It'll derail all the plans. Like people think they're driving upstate for a weekend, and they don't anticipate how much room they have to have in the car and stuff.
What does he read?
Anything from neurology books to crappy mysteries to philosophy books. But he does not write, and he would not respect the Kucinich method in this because he does not believe in writing in books or folding books. He'll highlight and underline medical textbooks. But
that's
nothing,
a thing. Readers have different views on that. I like writing
stuff
in
out. Me
books.
too. I love that. Yeah.
All right, great show. So
we'll
see you again next week.
Yeah.